Right, okay. I want to show you or give you a little bit of guidance on how you do flow charts properly. I ask you to do this a lot, and there's a good reason for that. But there's a lot of pitfalls people can fall into here when trying to do a flow chart, especially when they try and rush it. So what we're after here is going for something like this, which is a whole lot of text in paragraph form, into something that's far simpler, far more straightforward, far more visually, I don't want to say appealing really, but there's a great emphasis on the process that's taking place there. So let's just first have a look at why I think this is a thing that you should be doing. So the first thing is it forces you to process the information. Okay, you can't just read that information and then what we're trying to avoid here is you're thinking that just by reading a paragraph you're done with it. You need to process it, and a really good way of processing a sequence of events is to put it into a flow chart. The other thing is it simplifies the process. It can take something that seems quite daunting and you just get the key information out of that as the essence, the backbone of your flow chart, and having that basic information in steps can, by simplifying it in that way, can make it easier to recall and easier to understand. And it also creates this opportunity to improve what you've got, okay, either by adding diagrams or just representing things slightly differently to improve the clarity of the information. And that means it's going to improve your understanding and it's going to make it easier to recall the information. Okay, so let's have a look at an example. Okay, this is the flowchart of inhalation. This is information taken from GCSE. Here's the task to take this information and to convert it into a flowchart. So it's just a paragraph of information. There are a sequence of steps in there. So we said the ribs, intercostal muscles and diaphragm all play important roles in ventilation, breathing. When you inhale, the intercostal muscles contract, pulling the ribcage upwards and outwards. The diaphragm contracts, so causing it to become flattened rather than dome-shaped. As a result of the actions of both the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, lung volume increases. Let's move that out of the way. And the air pressure inside decreases, and this causes air to be drawn into the lungs. Okay, now, common thing people do when they're doing a flowchart, they take the easy way out. They just take the first sentence, write it out, draw an arrow. Take another sentence, write it out, draw an arrow, and continue and continue. And that is absolutely the wrong way to go about it, because the whole idea here is we're trying to improve our understanding, and that means processing the information. And you could do that, what's been shown there, without understanding anything on there. You are simply rewriting everything exactly as it is, but you're separating the sentences with an arrow. It's by and large a waste of time. So this is what you should be doing. Let's take that same steps that they wrote out there and say, well, what's actually the important, simple information that comes out of there? This first sentence actually doesn't mean anything. This is just an introduction. It just says the ribs, intercostal muscles and diaphragm all play important roles in ventilation or breathing. Well, okay, why don't we just get on with saying what actually happens here? So let's look at the intercostal muscles. So what happens? First thing, intercostal muscles contract. Great. What does that do? What's the consequence of that? The rib cage is pulled upwards and outwards. Next thing, diaphragm contracts. And what's the consequence of that? Causes it to become flattened rather than dome-shaped. It then says, as a result of the actions of both of these, the lung volume increases, and as a result, then the air pressure decreases, and this causes air to be drawn into the lungs. Okay, now that's a lot better. There's been some thinking about what's the key information needs to be taken out of that. This then becomes a lot simpler to recall, but by putting it, the act of putting it into that form will improve your understanding. But it could be better, so let's go again. How can we improve this? Well, the first thing we need to consider the layout. So let me go back to the information that was given there. It says, look, as a result of the actions of both the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. So it's a consequence of this step and this step that together result in the lung volume increasing. So really, we shouldn't say this implies at the moment is that the rib cage pulled down upwards and outwards causes the diaphragm to contract, and that's not true. These happen independently. The contraction of the intercostal muscles and the contraction of the diaphragm happen independently, and each have their own effects. So what we should be showing here instead is that first stage, intercostal muscles contract, ribcage pulled upwards and outwards. At the same time, diaphragm contracts and it becomes flattened. Collectively, those two things together cause the lung volume to increase, so the air pressure decreases and air is drawn into the lungs. Again, this requires an understanding in order to be able to do this, to appreciate that both of those contribute. Those actions contribute to a single thing, which is increasing the lung volume. Okay, next thing, how can we make this better? So what else can we do? This is the final version. So one of the best things you can add on is pictures and diagrams. And ideally, you would do that at each stage. You can show the intercostal muscles contracting. You can show the diaphragm contracting, what it does. But actually, what I've got here is just I've taken a picture that shows everything. Just for ease, I've done this. But really, I would like to show it happen at each stage or certain key stages. It's not good just doing that, because how does this picture tie in with this flowchart? You've got to make them work. So what we can do is we can number this part here taking place on here. Look, there's the intercostal muscles contracting, then the rib cage is pulled upwards and outwards. That's the second thing that happens. At the same time, I've got the diaphragm here becoming flatter as a result of contracting. Okay, I've changed the colour. I've called them 1 and 2. I haven't called these 3 and 4 because they're happening at the same time, but I've changed the colour to suggest that this is sort of a separate part, independent part. Now I've changed colour again. The lung volume increases, so the air pressure decreases, and as a result then air is drawn into the lungs. So let's move this the other way. There you can see that then. So the low pressure in the thoracic cavity due to increased volume. Okay. Now we could go a bit better here now. I also think it's worth adding what I would call additional supplementary information on here. Things that aren't part of the main flowchart, but they're worth knowing. You can call them explanatory notes sometimes, just things that you should add on. So I've got a few here. First of all, ventilation was mentioned at the beginning. Well, there's no mention of ventilation here, and it is a new term. So I've added that on, actually next to the title. Look, bear in mind, ventilation is equal to breathing. The other thing I've left off this idea in the flowchart that the diaphragm is dome-shaped when it's relaxed, and I think that's probably something we should include. Otherwise, without it, you might say, well, if it's become flattened, what was it before? I've mentioned here that, look, as a general rule of physics, as volume increases, pressure decreases. Volume is inversely proportional to pressure. So look, whenever you've got a volume increasing, automatically the pressure will decrease. That's not something that's in the initial paragraph, but it's the sort of thing you could add on if it helps you. It's not part of the process, but it's explanatory information. And this final bit, it just says air drawn into the lungs. Well, why is that? Well, air is drawn in because the air pressure outside is now higher than it is inside. The air pressure in the lungs has decreased. So now it's higher outside than inside and air is drawn in. I think that's good explanatory additional information that's worth adding on. Again, not part of the flowchart, but things you'd have on the side that you say, I know this isn't the main process, but this is worth having. So you see now we've gone by simplifying, only having the key information, considering the layout, adding drawings or diagrams and linking them into the flowchart, and then adding additional information. We have a finished product here where hopefully the process has improved the understanding, and actually the finished product actually will help with your recall as well, because they're much simpler steps too. Okay, hope that's useful. Keep that in mind when you're doing a flowchart, please.